Good afternoon to all. Welcome, Tobias and Christian, to this webinar series on theories of regulation. My name is David Levy-Faur, and I'm running the seminar, and we have a website and a YouTube channel, and you are always welcome to subscribe and watch the dozens of videos that we have on various aspects of regulation and governance. Today with us, two leading scholars with two innovative projects. Both are doing complementary project on surveying civil servants. And the ideas of those both projects is to have infrastructures for the social sciences and public policy, public administration, public management infrastructure that will take us beyond the current abilities to do research. So we have two presentations, two projects, and we start with Professor Tobias Bach with a new project on the Norwegian panel on public administration. Tobias is a professor of political science at the Department of Political Science at the University of Oslo, Norway. Is a leading scholar on public administration, bureaucratic politics, and is using a lot of comparative perspective. Is just about to complete projects that I was part of, trust and regulation in Europe. And it's a pleasure to have you here with us, Tobias. And the floor is yours. So yes. The panel on public administrator first, and then Christian Schuster on global survey of public servants.
Yes, thank you so much, David, for the kind invitation. So here you go. Wait a second. Just make sure that
on my screen it's excellent.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so yes, so what I will present today, what's called the panel of public administrators in Norway. I think I haven't written Norway anywhere else in the presentation, but it is located in Norway. So I'd like to say something about how the panel is organized, and I'll also say something about why we need such a panel, why me and my colleagues think this is necessary, and then I'll say a few words about the advantages of organizing data collection in such a panel, and then I'll go on saying a little bit about what we have achieved so far, and some of what we think are exciting prospects of possibilities for future research using this panel and similar infrastructure. So just to take this as a starting point is also that I'm very much would like to share our experiences so far, because I think this is sort of a model that could be used in different contexts as well. Maybe at some point we'll have different panels in different countries that can be connected. So to give you an overview of the panel, it is a research infrastructure used to facilitate data collection for researchers. So the panel consists basically of people, several central government employees that are have consented to completing surveys, including survey experiments on a regular basis. And in that sense, this is an infrastructure that can be used by different research teams. So it's not like me and my colleagues who are working with this closely are kind of owning the time of these people, but it can be filled by different research projects, and I will get back to that. And the idea is when the panel will be fully up and running, that will be able to run 2 surveys with these bureaucrats per year. Also, just as a remark in the beginning, is that for now, as we started this only a few years ago, we are focusing on central government employees, but in the long run, we would definitely want to expand this to include local government employees as well. So how is this organized? The panel of public administrators is what I think is a unique cooperation between several of the strongest in universities and research institutes in Norway when it comes to social science research and social science research on bureaucracies. So on the right hand side of my presentation, I pasted the cover page of a recent publication in Norwegian, where we are arguing why do we need such an infrastructure for doing research on public administration in Norway. And there you have all the people that are closely involved in this endeavor. And on a day-to-day basis, we are sort of running this primarily with Jarle Tondal and Jakob Osch and myself, but other partners are involved as well in our scientific board. In terms of the running of this, the technical parts, this is done at the University of Bergen in cooperation with a private company that is actually taking care of the really hands-on tasks of bringing surveys out in the field and gathering the data, writing technical reports, and these sorts of things. So the panel of public administrators is not a standalone enterprise, but it's actually part of a larger infrastructure project, which is located in what's called the Digital Social Science Core Facility at the University of Bergen, that was built up by our colleague Elisabeth Ivarsflaten. And what she did is essentially build up what's called a panel of citizens. So that's which is an infrastructure for surveying citizens based on a probability sample of the Norwegian population, and which has been running for, I think, 10 years now, and which has been able to gather very, very exciting data. At the later stage, other colleagues in Bergen started a panel of representatives, so of elected politicians, including national ones, but there aren't so many of those, so most of them are local ones. And so some years ago, there were several actually independent initiatives of starting a panel of public administrators. And I was part of this discussion, and the end of the conclusion of that discussion was that we should develop a panel of public administrators, and basically copy the model that has been used for these for the citizen panel and the panel of representatives, and that's what we did. And in a pilot 2 years ago, we also did a panel of journalists, which was not that successful. So I can also be very honest about it, but we're in this for the long run, so we will reapply for getting a grant for national infrastructure this year, and so we hope that we can include journalists in this in the long run as well. I will briefly get back to these other panels towards the end of my talk, because having not only a panel of administrators but also panels of citizens and politicians provides unique opportunities for doing new types of research. But for now, I will just focus on the administrators. So what is the problem? Why do we actually need such an infrastructure? And with my colleagues, we're always talking about the so-called survey monster. So I have the survey monster here. What is that? Well, essentially, if you are interested in studying bureaucrats, and especially central government bureaucrats, policymaking bureaucrats, and regulatory bureaucrats in ministries and agencies, you're facing a common pool resource problem. There is only a limited pool of respondents in central government, and when you have several research teams, research projects that want to survey these people, you are risking a survey overload of the same respondents, and this will in the long run result in declining response rates, and that's what we're already seeing. And there's also a risk of sort of contamination. If it may appear as a sort of quick fix for any sort of research project to send out a survey to bureaucrats, but if that survey is not well done, not well thought through, if it's super long, all of these things, then there's a credibility problem for science as such. So that is one big problem. The other problem is that surveys often, would ask the same questions or similar questions, but researchers can't coordinate. So that has a substantive dimensions, what is being asked, but it also has the dimension of timing. Access to respondents is a problem. There are in the field of public administration, public policy, we see quite a lot of surveys and survey experiments being done on citizens, but actually not so much on actual bureaucrats. And access to bureaucrats is just a big job in itself if you are starting your own research project, gathering email addresses, going beyond firewalls. All of these things are difficult. And finally, many surveys have been done already, but it's not always possible to access existing data. I mean, there are many good examples, but there are also examples where this hasn't happened. So how does this panel deal with these problems and other related problems? First of all, we are doing an open call for survey items. So essentially, we're saying we want to do a survey which will take a maximum of 15 minutes, but we want different projects to fill the space in this survey. So we're doing an open call. You can see the open call on the right hand side here. Then this goes to a scientific committee, which does a peer review, which gives feedback, and then there's a sort of revision process. And once survey items have been accepted, then there will be the technical programming and extensive piloting, for example, with former civil servants on these survey questions. Once the data has been collected, all the researchers that had submitted questions or experiments will get access to data sets, and we just got access to the latest round this week. And at the later stage, then anonymized data is being published, open access for anyone to use, for example, for other researchers, for students, for journalists. One thing that I would like to mention here, which I think is crucial and which distinguishes this also, if you're familiar with survey research of citizens, where people would, for example, get payment to participate. This is not the case. We don't pay bureaucrats, and neither do our colleagues pay the citizens that are participating in the citizen panel. So this is all completely sort of voluntary, no payment. And another thing is that all the researchers can get access to all the questions and data that have been collected. Of course, they will need to talk to their colleagues that suggested questions, but essentially you can have access to the full data that has been collected by your colleagues, and also going back in time. So basically, this is sort of the idea, is that we have this what you call a time sharing model, where you have sort of the old idea of how to run surveys of bureaucrats, for example, is that, okay, you have one project, you include all sorts of questions in there, you have to ask about age and gender and all of these basic things, and then the time of the participants is filled with this one project. Whereas the idea behind our panel and the other related panels is really that, okay, there are some time spent by participants on filling in basic questions, but then the rest of the time is being shared by different participants. And as you are used to, like from, for example, election polls, it is normally enough to survey 1,000-ish respondents for most items. So you can actually, if you have a sufficient number of respondents, you can actually split this up in several groups. Now, what have we done so far? Well, we have done now 3 waves of respondents, and so the last wave was really successful with almost 3,000 respondents in the Norwegian Central Administration. And now we're starting to see how things developed over time, because what we ask people is to register as panel members so that we can ask them in consecutive rounds as well. And what we see here is sort of in the figure is how people that were recruited in the first wave, this is the green line, I mean, around 53% of those participated also in the second wave. So there's a quite tremendous drop, but then towards the third wave, the drop is not as dramatic. And this is exactly what we know happens also with citizen panels, for example. So there are people dropping out, but not all of them, and it's quite predictable. Right. So what is there in terms of substance? I mean, in many ways, the infrastructure as such, you could call it, it's a sort of an empty shell, you know. It's, so as I said, it's filled with content by different research projects, which then also have to pay for the time spent by participants on their items. But what we are asking, obviously, we are asking some things that will always be part of any survey. This is sort of basic demographic information, educational level, educational subject, where in the bureaucracy they're working, which hierarchical level, what are they working with, and we're asking questions about how long they have worked in government. But in addition, there's also questions which fall under demographic information that you would normally perhaps not ask bureaucrats, such as where they live or their marital status. And this is because this data is also used, or people that may not be hardcore administrative researchers, but that are interested in more general questions, may also use this data when they're combining bureaucrats and, for example, citizens as respondents. So now, then, yes, I said that already. So the rest of the survey, of the public administrators survey, or when we're fielding it, is then filled with topics that may be related to the workplace of bureaucrats, what bureaucrats are doing, obviously, but they may also be related to completely different things, such as attitudes towards migration, for example, which has been covered, or environmental attitudes, or such like. And this is because it's an open infrastructure. So we check this actually, and we found that most of the time that's actually not a big problem. Bureaucrats are not less likely, for example, to answer about migration related issues, but we see a drop relative to citizens when it comes to political attitudes, so voting behavior and these sorts of things. Maybe not so surprising, but we can see that. Now, moving over towards another topic, which is sort of this idea that if you have a panel where you can ask people several times and sort of observe them, follow them over a longer period of time, you can actually use that for longitudinal studies, and even for panel studies in the narrow sense of the term, that you're actually observing the same person and asking the same question sort of over and over again. And we are now in an ongoing discussion about, well, what is sort of the equivalent of asking bureaucrats, like you're asking citizens, what would you vote for if there was an election next week? Sort of, we want to get at some sort of questions that we want to ask regularly to get the time series, or ideally even in the individual panel data on important questions. And this is sort of an ongoing process, and we have discussed topics such as turnover intention, workplace satisfaction, or how much importance bureaucrats would attach to different values, or, for example, the importance of politicians in their decision making. So I'll now, towards the end of my talk, I just give you an idea of where we see the potential of this panel to develop further. Because so there are two dimensions here. One is, I mean, we're having this panel of administrators, and what you can do is sort of have collect cross-sectional data. You do a one-shot experiment with the data, but you can also compare developments over time. And you can also compare and run paired or coordinated experiments and surveys with the other panels, with politicians, with citizens. So here there are different opportunities, and I would like to highlight two of them. So if you look at over time comparison of bureaucrats, I mean, we would say that there are many theories in public administration that are about change, but we don't have very often very good data about what is about developments over time. So we need to collect this data, which, for example, could tell us something about the effects of both planned external events such as reforms, organizational restructuring, changes in government, or unplanned events such as crisis. So getting time series data or even individual level panel data through this infrastructure will help us to make better do better research on longitudinal developments, which are crucial in our discipline. And the second point I would like to make is that by coordinating data collection with other populations, such as citizens or politicians, we can develop very relevant new insights. So they have been, for example, in the pilot we were running with the different panels, scholars were studying attitudes towards the geographical representation of judges in the Constitutional Court in Norway, or they were comparing citizens, bureaucrats, journalists, and politicians' attitudes towards media. So this is something that has been done. Or experimental studies. I'm currently working on a paper with colleagues where we used also all these 4 types of populations in an experiment about the appointment of a hypothetical top administrator and how different populations rate the qualifications of that hypothetical person, and what that tells us about the legitimacy of perhaps bringing outsiders into the public sector. So think that was it for now. I mean, there's a lot of more that could have been said, but I hope that I could sort of convey the idea that this is an exciting thing to do. And what I really enjoy about this project or this infrastructure is that it allows me and others, to work together on a sort of common infrastructure which benefits the entire profession. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tobias. I'll take a few comments from the participant. I see Nikolai raising his hand, and I'd like also to invite Jarle, who is part of the project, to comment, maybe things to add. But Nikolai, go first.
Thank you, David. Actually, I didn't want to comment. I wanted to clap my hands, saying thank you to Tobias for this really interesting talk. I only could comment. I would like to have such an infrastructure in Germany and to be able to research, because I know from my own experience that it's really hard to get into a public administration to do the surveys. And if there's somebody to does this job for you and to does it on a high qualitative level, it would be really great. So I can't thank you enough to have this role model, and maybe in 20 years we also have such an infrastructure in Germany, or maybe never, I don't know.
I feel the same. Thank you very much, Nikolai. And Jarle, do you want to add something? You don't have to, but if you want.
Yeah, but I could do. I mean, we have, as Tobias said, it's a joy to work together on this building of the infrastructure and the use of it. So the collegial part is really exciting. I think we also, when we discussed the benefits of this infrastructure, we at some point also came up with the challenges of. You remember the challenges that we face by building up this, and there are several. And we also want to be open on that, and we are writing on it at the moment. And one is this challenge between the overtime aspect of it versus the cross-sectional, and how much the distinction between the questions that we need to have over time in order to build panels versus the cross-sectional questions that could be built from the project that comes in an open access infrastructure. So that's one of them. The second one is, of course, the funding part, and that's a long shot. So we are working on that as well. That is to get basic funding for building an infrastructure that is quite costly. So and that's also a part for work for this year. And yeah, I can come up with them a lot of others. That is, when it comes to the open access part, is also whether this infrastructure should be opened for international colleagues to fielding questions. So far, we have it's only for Norwegian researchers, but why?
Yeah,
it could be a laboratory for the study of democracy for colleagues elsewhere.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much, Jarle. And we'll come back to you, Tobias. But we start now with Christian Schuster. I will spot you to everyone and make you the co-host, the speaker now. Thank you very much for joining us. And the floor is you. Christian is doing the global survey of public servants. Please, Christian.
Thank you so much, David, for the invitation. My name is Christian Schuster. I'm a professor in public management at University College London. It's my pleasure to present the global survey of public servants to you. That survey currently brings together responses from over 1.3 million public servants in over 1,300 government institutions in 23 countries, but that number is growing. So this is sort of version 1.0. I should say that while I'm presenting this, this is really joint work with the Stanford Governance Project, led by Francis Fukuyama, the World Bank Bureaucracy Lab, led by Dan Rogger and Zayed Hasnain, and then my two very, very long-standing collaborators, Kim Nicholson and Jan Mayer Saling. Now, before I structure the talk, I want to talk a little bit about why we think it's helpful to survey public servants around the world in a comparable way. And that has a lot to do with how we currently measure comparative public administration and the potential limitations that has. So it's probably uncontestable within public administration that one of our core tasks as scholars is to try to understand how public administrations around the world differ, and to try to understand how these differences matter for outcomes. So for us to be useful to practice, for instance, it's helpful if we can shed light on which way of managing public servants is most effective for government effectiveness, for instance, and how does it differ between countries. Now, most measures of comparative public administration to date try to get at these differences across public administrations through country-level indicators, by asking experts, by asking households, by asking firms. So think, for instance, the worldwide governance indicators. And so the one curious implication of that is that most measures of comparative bureaucracy are based on asking anybody but bureaucrats. So basically, they're based on not asking bureaucrats. And that has contributed to a long range of scholarships that has underscored the limitations of these existing country-level indicators. For instance, one of them is a level of analysis problem. So there are oftentimes big differences across institutions within the same government. But if you have a country-level indicator, you somehow have to ask an expert to come up with some sort of country-level mean that aggregates all these differences that we are but not measuring and not aware of. A second problem is perceptual biases. We are asking people outside government to give us insights on how the inside of government works. And there are also concerns with the actionability of these measures. So if you tell a government it has an effectiveness score of 3.2 out of 5, it's very hard for that government to know what it could actually be doing better. And what we're trying to do with the Global Survey of Public Servants is to overcome these limitations through a global survey of public servants that sheds light on two particular aspects of comparative public administration. The first, so in other words, not every way in which public administrations differ, but two particular aspects. The first is we can ask surveys of public servants around the world to inquire about their motivations and to inquire about their behavior. For instance, whether they want to stay in the public sector, whether they want to leave, whether they're satisfied with their jobs. But we can also ask them about management practices and their experience with them. We can ask them how they got their jobs, for instance, how their performance is evaluated, how their performance is managed, how they're led, among others. And when we ask public servants in government institutions around the world, then of course we can do that. We can generate data at the level of each individual public servant, at the level of each organization, and at the level of the country as a whole, rather than just generating these country-level indicators. So in other words, we're trying to overcome the limitations of existing comparative measures, focus in particular on the lenses that surveys of public servants can give you. So how do we do that in practice? So in this project, we're in the first place collaborating with governments to either introduce national surveys of public servants. So a lot of governments around the world do not have national surveys of public servants, or to help them redesign surveys of public servants. So particularly in the OECD, there are a number of governments that have surveys of public servants. So we're working with some of them to try to harmonize them more internationally. We're then trying to publish the resulting data in a global indicators data set, at least for those countries that let us. So our current global indicators data set, as I mentioned, has 23 countries in it. You can go on our website, globalsurveyofpublicservants.org/indicators. I'll have the link later on, and you can look at them. And I'll show you some of the example indicators later on. We also have a core module that we try to implement across the countries that we survey to try to make public servant survey data more consistent and comparable across countries. We also do a lot of methodological work to try to understand more about how different ways in which we survey public servants shapes, for instance, how they respond, how different questions shape the kind of information we get about different topics. We have a forthcoming book, Dan Rogger and myself, called Government Analytics that has 8 chapters just on that. And then, of course, we need to be valuable for the governments that we work with. Otherwise, why would they allow us to run national surveys of public servants? And we also generate management diagnostics, arguably high-quality management diagnostics for the governments that we work with. We've done over 500 management reports for countries and institutions so far. And if you go on our website, you have lots of sort of practitioner testimonials telling you about how that was received and how that had helped them improve public administration. I don't want to talk so much about the practice part, but I want to talk about what all this data now means for academics, in particular, also where sort of our conceptual methodological approach, and then how scholars can actually use this data going forward. So just to contextualize what we're measuring, we have a conceptual approach that basically reflects this dual ambition that we have. We want to be useful for practice, but we also want to generate data that helps scholars understand the nature of the state in different governments, the nature of public administration in different countries. And so what we did is we, on the one hand, reviewed the kind of measures that governments themselves ask when they survey public servants, sort of in major countries like the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, etc. Those measures tend to be heavily leaning towards organizational behavior, so things like job satisfaction, teamwork, leadership. But then on the other hand, we also wanted to measure what scholars often focus on when they compare public administrators around the world, which often goes back to sort of academic ideal types or models of public governance, such as, for instance, patrimonialism, Weberian bureaucracy, new public management. Each of them have implications for what you want to measure, for instance, meritocratic recruitment, performance incentives, etc. And so basically our topic choice integrates both these measures that allow us to understand these models of public governance and measures that are core to what governments are most interested in themselves. We then developed a questionnaire to measure these topics, which first try to take existing measures wherever they exist and wherever they're already validated. So for instance, there are hundreds of studies validating measures of job satisfaction. We don't have to invent a new one. But then there were a number of measures where we don't have hundreds of validation studies. So for instance, if you ask public servants about how they got their job and how meritocratic that was, for instance, there's not a lot out there. So we developed our own measures. We then tried to phrase them in a way that is as comparable as possible across countries. We did over 150 cognitive interviews with bureaucrats in dozens of countries just to try to get a sense of how they understand different ways of phrasing these questions. And then once we collected the data, we also did a lot of validation of our measures with our data. I can speak more about that if you're interested later on. Now, we then implemented a survey with a relatively common methodological approach across countries. So across all of the countries in the data set that I'll show you in a second, what you will see are central government bureaucrats. So across all of the countries, our survey population is at least a very broad set of central government institutions. And then within that, we either invited every public servant in the institution to respond to the survey or a representative sample of those public servants to respond to the survey, which means you're not seeing frontline officials such as sort of teachers, doctors, you're not seeing local government, for instance. You'll then see in the dashboard when you go online and you hover over the different indicators that we have some countries where we survey public servants online. That's preferred where it's possible, but then some where you don't have that infrastructure, where you don't have all public servants in central government having email addresses, for instance. There we had in-person surveys. So we typically took a representative sample of public servants that we surveyed in person. You might then worry that differences are because of survey modes between countries. We did a field experiment in Romania where we then randomly assigned respondents to respond in person and online. We found very, very small differences between the two. So we have some confidence that you can compare the two. When you run online surveys of public servants across countries, even if you have similar survey population frames, you will get different response rates. We're also agnostic about that. So we're putting different bars for different countries with different response rates next to each other. We again have field experimental evidence from Romania that suggests that at least at the national level, varying response rates don't have strong impact on mean. So we have some faith that you can compare that. And lastly, I talked earlier about the limitations of country level indicators. If you compare civil service surveys across countries, there are obviously also limitations. And I want you to be mindful of when you look at the data, and we're very transparent about them. So we have differences in language. No matter how many cognitive interviews we conduct, there might be some remnant differences that are due to language, not to differences in actual means, differences in culture, which can create differences in social desirability bias or meaning. In some countries, particularly where we take existing government surveys, I'll show you that in a second, there might also be some differences in wording or scales. So these are just some caveats to keep in mind. Our current data set has 23 countries, as I mentioned, 1,300 institutions. 18 of these 23, we conducted the national surveys of public servants ourselves. We meaning either myself, Jan Meyer-Zarling and Kim Mikkelsen, or the Stanford Governance Project team, or the World Bank Bureaucracy Lab. And there are 5 countries that conduct their own surveys, like the US, the UK, Australia, Canada. We took their surveys into our data set, and then you see in the cross-country part, whatever is comparable is basically made comparable, and whatever is not comparable just appears in sort of a country survey indicator tab. The data set you can currently download has, with confidence intervals, country averages, institutional averages for these 1,300 institutions, and then lots of sort of demographic splits, gender, age, contract type, etc. We very much expect to eventually also publish an anonymized individual level data set in compliance with all data protection limitations that will apply to doing this across a lot of countries, but that's something we're also working towards. Okay, so let me now in the next sort of 10 minutes just show you some uses that scholars might get out of this data set. The first important use that we see for it is that it just allows you to counter some stereotypes that we have about public administrators around the world that might appear in common discourse, but that might also appear in a review or comment to your paper. So one stereotype, for instance, is that generally public servants don't have performance incentives, that basically work effort doesn't matter. And we find that that's generally true for pay. So when we ask public servants whether performance matters for pay, very few of them tell us that it is important. But we find that it's generally not true for sort of longer run career incentives, so for longer run promotion incentives. So in most of the countries that we surveyed, most public servants think that their work performance matters for their promotion prospects. There are some exceptions, but in most countries, we do see that public servants do think that their work performance actually has relevance for their long run promotion trajectory, even if not for their short run pay trajectory. So first use, and you can do that for a lot of indicators, is just think about how that counters stereotypes that we might have about public administrators around the world. A second difference is that it can allow you to understand some sharp differences in either the attitudes of public servants around the world or management practices. And the emphasis here is on sharp differences because, as I mentioned earlier, if you have differences in language, for instance, you might see some smaller differences that are simply due to that. So we don't want to overinterpret small differences, but there's some differences that are really stark. So here's an example of the share of public servants that is satisfied with their pay in different countries around the world. And you can see that at the sort of bottom end, in a country like Ghana, for instance, 6% of public servants are satisfied with their pay, whereas at the top end, a country like the US, for instance, 65% of public servants are satisfied with their pay. And these differences are so stark that it's plausible that they actually reflect some significant differences, in this instance, in pay satisfaction across countries. And of course, within that range, there's then a lot of differences across different countries. And we see these differences across countries across a whole range of management practices. Here's another one. This is job stability. One of our questions is whether public servants think it would be difficult to dismiss them, just on an agreement scale. And in Brazil, for instance, 70% of public servants tell us it's difficult to dismiss them, whereas in a neighboring country like Chile, for instance, it's 30%. In a country like Slovakia, it's 21%. So we have these sort of stereotypes, popular notions about job stability and bureaucracy, but it actually plays out, again, very differently across different countries. And you can sort of, again, absorb these sharp differences and just learn how public administrations actually differ in the experience of public servants across different countries. Now, beyond sort of understanding these differences and countering stereotypes, you can also understand changes over time, particularly in recruitment. The way we can do this is we have very large samples of bureaucrats, because we typically run national surveys in almost all of the countries that we survey. In a place like Chile, for instance, we have over 20,000 respondents. And so we can cut or subset our data according to by when public servants are recruited, for instance. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to understand whether those that were recruited more than 20 years ago, or more than 30 years ago, more than 50 years ago, are different from those that were recruited more recently. And that, of course, allows you to understand changes over time. Here's just one example. This is the share of public servants that tells us that they learned about their first public sector job through a job advertisement rather than through word of mouth. And that's an important part of merit recruitment, that jobs are advertised, you apply for a job, that's how you learn about a job, not just through word of mouth. And what you can see is that across countries here, there is a significant increase in the share of public servants that learn about their jobs through job advertisements. So in Chile, for instance, this is here more than 20 years ago, 18% of public servants learned about their job through job advertisements. In the last 10 years, it's 44%. In a place like Croatia, for instance, more than 20 years ago, 53% learned about their job through a job advertisement. In the last 10 years, it was 82%. Okay. So what that allows you to understand is just how civil services, in terms of recruitment, evolve over time. We, of course, don't just have job advertisement, a range of other indicators about recruitment. But what it goes to say is it can help you understand recruitment over time in a way that we previously couldn't. And it's actually a really positive story. In most countries around the world, there's been more transparency about public sector recruitment in sort of comparing sort of history with what we see today, something you otherwise can't really track very well. Now, a fourth important use is it helps you understand the centralized or decentralized nature of the state and the civil service. So one advantage of having microdata is that we don't just have an average for a country, but we can split that by institution, okay? So here you can see pay competitiveness, so the percentage of public servants that thinks that pay is competitive with the private sector. In the top, in Croatia, in the top graph in Croatia, these are different institutions in Croatia, and in the bottom graph in Albania. And so you can see that in Croatia, for instance, there are some institutions where 6% of public servants think their pay is competitive with the private sector. And there are other institutions where 91% of public servants, these are all within the central government, 91% of public servants thinks that pay is competitive within the private sector. So there's huge variation within this management practice, which reflects, of course, that that pay setting is more decentralized in Croatia, and that leads to big differences in perceived pay competitiveness in the country. Whereas in Albania, a country where this is more centralized, you see much smaller differences. It goes from 42% to 64%. And you can do that across, of course, across management practices to understand which of these management practices are more centrally managed and which of them are actually decentralized, and to cause a lot of heterogeneity across the same government, across institutions. A fifth use you can make of it is understand differences not just across institutions, and so centralization and decentralization within central government, but also understand demographic differences in employee attitudes and management practices and how they vary across countries. So for instance, how do generational differences vary across countries? How do differences between permanent and temporary employees vary across countries? Or how do gender differences vary across countries? Here's just one example. This is the percent of public servants satisfied with their pay. And you can see men and women in different countries here in our sample. And what you can see here is that there are some countries where, as you might sort of stereotypically expect, men are more satisfied with their pay than women. So I think the general stereotype is that gender pay gaps in the public sector in favor of men, and that in some countries appears to then lead to men being more satisfied with their pay than women. Places like Kosovo, for instance, Brazil, Guatemala, Chile, and others. But then there are also some countries where women are substantially more, or a much larger share of women is satisfied with their pay than men, for instance, in the United Kingdom, in Ethiopia, and others. And that, of course, then begs the question, so why is that the case? Why are we observing these differences? And before we had this sort of data, that's something we never really studied, because we didn't have data that would even allow us to understand that these differences between different demographic groups differ across countries in a way. And so with this data, you can then start studying that. And then if none of this convinced you and you felt like none of this is useful, just one final use for that review comment you often get, which is, tell me something about the generalizability of the case that you study, the case being either the country or the organization. So one thing you can, of course, also do with the data is use it to contextualize your country case. So for instance, imagine you were having a paper on pay competitiveness, and you were trying to make a case that, say, the Brazil is a particularly generalizable or not generalizable case, or an outlier case. Because you can make these global comparisons, the data allows you to place your country within others, or relative to others in the data set. So one thing that's interesting about Brazil, for instance, this is lack of competitiveness with the private sector. So it has very few public servants that think their pay is not competitive. So pay competitiveness is really high. And it has very few public servants that are satisfied with their job at the same time. So depending on which paper you write here, you would come out very differently in terms of generalizability. And you can, of course, do that not just for a country. If you're studying a particular public sector institution, you can do the same. So here, for instance, you see an overlay of different countries. These are the gray bars in pay satisfaction in different countries around the world. And then the light blue ones are different organizations inside the UK's civil service, and pay satisfaction different organizations inside the UK civil service. And so if you were studying one of them in your paper, for instance, you could look at this and then, of course, deduce whether the particular organization that you study is actually, globally relatively close to the mean in the particular variable that you study, or is an outlier. And in the case of the UK civil service, for instance, some organizations have some of the world's highest pay satisfaction relative to other countries, and others have some of the world's lowest, lower than Liberia, Ethiopia, and others. So these are a number of ways in which you can use the data set. I hope that scholars come up with many others as well. So in short, the Global Survey of Public Servants is a global research initiative to better understand how public services work and also to help governments manage public servants better. The sort of version 1.0 has responses from over 1.3 million public servants, over 1,300 institutions in 23 countries. We hope we have sort of a version 1.1 in fall with a few more countries and a few hundred more institutions. We also have conducted a number of thematic surveys. So one of them was, for instance, was a survey with over 100,000 public servants in 7 countries on remote work. We also hope to publish that shortly on the website, including the individual level data set for other scholars to make use of. So in other words, we have this core survey that focuses on the concepts I laid out earlier, but then we also run thematic surveys on particular topics of interest that we can then compare across countries. We very much think of this as a public good. We're very keen to collaborate with other scholars that are sort of interested in undertaking national surveys of public servants. There are lots of resources on the website, but we're also very happy to facilitate that. If you're interested in doing sort of methodological validation work on the survey itself, that's also something that's very welcome. If you're aware of other data sets that meet these criteria, so in other words, that have survey populations of central government bureaucrats that are, in terms of the population frame, either representative or a census that we could incorporate, we're very keen to do that as well. Thinking in particular, given the audience or the participants here of like Israel and Norway, we don't have those 2 countries yet. And of course, any other feedback on the core questionnaire and the data dashboard is also very welcome. And if you want to learn more, our website is globalsurveyofpublicservants.org. If you click on globalsurveyofpublicservants.org/indicators, you get to the data dashboard. And if you want to read up more on the initiative, there's a piece in Public Administration Review that details that more. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Christian. It was a fascinating presentation. I'll take a few comments from the audience. If someone wants to get in first, otherwise I will ask myself. I will put also Tobias in the center and myself. And now we are ready to ask questions. I will ask this first question. I think this is fascinating, but I'm thinking about, what can we take from that for other countries, and I was very happy to hear your invitation for Norway and also for Israel to take part. But I'm thinking, what are the advantages and disadvantages of combining the project or going alone? Kind of the Norwegian way or the, say, UCL, Stanford way? Can you think about those kind of advantage and disadvantage? Maybe Tobias, do you want to
yeah,
start?
Sure. I mean, I really love the project Christian and the others are doing, and it's super exciting. And of course, it has this comparative angle, which is absolutely essential if you want to do comparative public administration research, and that is also data that is that is used much more broadly. Often, administrative capacity and these sorts of things, they are relevant in many other contexts. So I think the strength of sort of the other project presented today is really this comparative dimension and sort of the whole validation work. That is absolutely super important, and I really love that. I mean, I think our project or our infrastructure sort of has the potential, absolutely, for example, to include some of the items that would be included in Christian's survey, or maybe you can collaborate with the government in Norway, who are also doing a regular survey of civil servants. But in our approach, it would not be possible to have a sort of huge battery of questions, because time is precious, and sort of our approach is more like, okay, you have an interesting idea, you have one experiment that you want to run, okay, you can do it, you get the results rather quick, but that's it, you don't get much more. So I understand your approach, you're collecting lots of more, like many variables, and that's good, and that's the benefit of the approach. But ours is different, and both are good in their own ways.
Christian, thank you. Tobias, Christian, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's sort of a horse race between these two projects. I think they have different objectives, and what I love about Tobias' project is that, and Tobias and collaborators' project is that it can significantly lower the costs of conducting these surveys and survey experiments, and in a way that I think is very rational if you think about sort of the amount of time, because we spend endless amounts of times dealing with firewalls and spam filters and government permissions and all of that, and if you have that in place and can use it over and over again and can facilitate that for others to run their own questions, I think that's fantastic. But I think that the objective is different, right? You basically have a research panel to conduct surveys and survey experiments with public administrators in a country versus sort of an attempt to create sort of a global data set. And I think that's useful both for researchers, but also I think very useful for practitioners and governments around the world. So they're just different objectives, and I think they're both hopefully valuable for the world.
Yeah, I can see why they are both valuable. Can you speak about the kind of the financial aspect and the human capital that is needed for both project? To what extent? I think yours is high. Yours, Christian, is kind of a very expensive one. You probably employ few people on that. And then the question is, what scale, if you can share us for, say, if you want to have one more country, what are the budget? What is the budget involved, and how do you run it in terms of hiring person? And also, Tobias, I wonder how much it costs, and to what extent you take most of your time, part of your time, or maybe a PhD is doing the job. How do you work on that? Christian, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we did have the good fortune of having initially a grant from what is now FCDO, so what was at the time DFID, the UK's foreign aid government arm that was funded through the British Academy. That was a £400,000 grant that allows us to do some of the initial surveys. We've successfully had subsequently had a number of other grant pots that we drew on to be able to run surveys. I don't think so. So the cost is heavily dependent on whether you can run surveys online or whether you have to employ in-person enumerators. Like sort of the latter basically almost doubles the cost of a single survey. It also depends on the existing government infrastructure and the amount of work that the government takes on. I think our ideal scenario is not that we sort of just run a survey and we leave, but actually what we are often trying to do is convince the government of the utility of implementing national surveys of public servants as management diagnostics, help them and train them to be able to do that, and then leave, and then they can continue running their own surveys. I think that for us is sort of the ideal outcome because it gives it much more sustainability over time. So I'm sort of a little bit loath to put a number because it has varied quite substantially across countries, but there is obviously work involved, but it's not as dramatic as you might think, and it heavily depends on if you have a government that already runs a national survey of public servants, then it's more a conversation about sort of what kind of measures do you have in there? Can we help you improve this as a diagnostic tool? It doesn't actually involve that much effort. So if Norway already runs an existing government-wide survey, it's more a conversation than a funding question. Same potentially with Israel.
I see. Do you go with the government always, or you kind of approach the public servant independently?
So particularly if you want to do online surveys, so generally speaking, we think of this as something that's helpful for research and something that's helpful for practice, and so we are very keen to run surveys in collaboration and in co-production with governments. Particularly if you run online surveys, there's also no way of getting a good response rate otherwise, because what you do is you collect you typically rely on them to share email addresses of the entirety of public servants across a broad range of central government institutions with you. Sometimes that's central government that has it. Sometimes you get it from each individual institution. Then you collaborate with the IT person in each institution to make sure that when your online platform sends out the survey invite, that is not filtered out and is not spammed out. Then you collaborate with the HR counterpart in each institution to encourage them to respond to the survey so that you could get good responses. So in other words, you typically rely on quite a lot of inputs and efforts from governments, which they're then, of course, only willing to do if what you're producing for them is valuable. So we sort of have an infrastructure around producing management diagnostics that has been, very well received by governments. That then allows us and gives us the access to generate this data for the public administration community.
Yeah, let me just very briefly answer your question, David. So the funding was, there was some sort of funding by the University of Bergen to basically start this whole infrastructure over there. And they also got some external funding to especially on this citizen panel. But then we are trying to sort of go over towards a model where we are doing a project-based funding, so that we have a sort of cost model where, say, 1 minute, asking bureaucrats for 1 minute will cost you around 3,000 euros or so. But then you get the data, you submit the questions, everything is done for you, and you get the data, and it's sort of validated and everything. So that's kind of the model where we're going to. But to be very honest, I don't have the exact costs here, because again, the infrastructure is sort of physically in Bergen, but they have quite a few people working on this, and also a private company being contracted to do this. So it's not for free. Infrastructure is definitely not for free. Yes.
Yep. Questions from the audience, or comments, and I see Nikolai, please.
Yes, also again, great respect to the endeavor of the global survey. It's fascinating to have this. I would like to know on which basis you decide on which countries you include. That would be my question, and I also have a comment, or combined with the question. Did I understand you correctly that you have the email addresses of the civil servants you are asking? Because we made the experience when we conducted a survey, and our respondents were judges, and the courts did not give us the email addresses. They insisted that we send the questionnaire to a central bureau of the court, and then they distributed it to the judges. And I'm really surprised that you managed to get the email addresses of the civil servants.
Yeah, thank you so much. So let me start with the latter question. So it is, from a sort of quality control perspective, generally preferable to have access to the email addresses, because you know exactly how many people you're sending your survey invitation to. You can understand, you can calculate response rates correctly. You can make sure that everyone has a chance to respond to the survey. That is generally tends to be our preference. There are alternative implementation modalities. One of them is that the government keeps the list of email addresses, but generates basically anonymous numbers. You then generate unique links for each of these numbers. And so everyone still gets a unique invitation, but you never see the email addresses. Or, which is the implementation modality you're referring to, is the government themselves distributes a link. We've done that in some countries as well, where governments, and that, of course, if governments share email addresses, there tends to be sort of there tend to be written agreements, and that these are not shared further, etc., etc. So we can't use them in the same way that, for instance, Tobias is using them for the panel. But there are different implementation modalities. I think the preferred one from a quality control perspective tends to be to have the email addresses, but we also haven't managed that in all countries, and for fair reasons, in the sense that governments sometimes want to not share them and ensure that they retain control over them. So and then so that's in regards to the second question. Sorry, what was the first question? What was the first question you asked?
On which basis?
The country selection. The country. So so I think there's sort of two-pronged approach. When governments already run employee surveys, we're keen to incorporate everything we can find. right? Because the cost of doing that is really low compared to going in another country and implementing your own survey. So we are sort of, if Norway and Israel were doing that, we'd be very keen to chat with them to see whether we can incorporate some of that. For our own surveys, that has largely been a function of where we ourselves, sort of governments that we previously worked with, where there's demand from governments, and also where we have funding. So there's some funding sources that basically are restricted to particular countries, and then we would approach those countries. But we have been surprised that we initially, when we started this out, basically almost 10 years ago now, we thought there would be very few countries that we could convince to do this. And the experience has actually been the opposite, that because you're basically providing them something that's, they have opportunity costs, but it's otherwise free for them. It's been valuable for them. And like the more countries you have, the more testimonials you have, the more countries realize it's helpful for them. So it's not been a question of governments not wanting to do this, but it's been more a question of where do we have capacity and where do we have funding.
Thank you very much, Christian. I think we are past the time, and I know that Christian has to leave, and Tobias probably as well. Thank you very much, all. See you in other activities of this webinar, and many, many thanks, and good luck to you, Christian and Tobias, in this important project that you have. Bye, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David.
Bye-bye.
See you.
Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.